Hello and welcome to part 2 of 3 for the dead and the dying. This video will cover funeral homes and cemetery offices. My name is Rebecca Whitman Koford, certified genealogist and certified genealogical lecturer. Death is no more than passing from one room into another. But there's a difference for me, you know, because in that other room, I shall be able to see. Helen Keller. For this 3-part lecture series on the dead and the dying, we cover these topics. In the first part, we covered death certificates and death record alternatives. In the second part, the focus is on funeral homes and cemetery offices, and we use a short case study at the end. As I mentioned in part 1 of this series, I very much stress the critical nature of using original documents. We can't find the original documents we need in one place. We go where the records are, whether they're online or offline. Some are textual and found by making an in-person visit to a repository. Some are on microfilm in a large library. And some we're lucky enough to find online as reliable images of the original records. So, during the discussion, watch for how many of the random samples of original documents were found textually in person at repositories, or in those large microfilm collections, or somewhere online. Icons in the lower left corners will identify where the record was found, and we're going to count them up at the end of the lecture. Let's start with funeral homes. Funeral homes are, above all, private businesses and are not required to share their files with the public. There is no Freedom of Information Act demands that you can make. So be very kind, be very patient when requesting help from a funeral home. It's a good idea to call ahead, make inquiries as to their rules, make an appointment to view records. Some of the modern funeral homes have bought out older businesses and retained the older businesses' records. Some funeral home records have been instead donated to university libraries or state historical societies. So check online catalogs for them. But just so you know, in this lecture, we are separating funeral homes from church-owned and operated cemeteries. In other words, in this lecture, I will not be covering church records that apply to cemeteries. That is a topic for a different lecture, but it is something to be aware of. What you also need to know is that records in the files for funeral homes vary widely. So let's talk about what we might find. Could be a death certificate or obituary. We might find the will or letters from a lawyer. We're very likely to find contracts with the name of the family and costs. But we also might find information that might be similar to that asked on a death certificate, like date of birth, place of birth, cause of death, things like that. Information on memorial services, family names, pallbearer names, religious identifiers, name of the clergy or a church name, and personal identifiers, especially if they had military service and their plot is going to be identified that way, or if the funeral home is putting together the obituary and wants to know more about club memberships, education, and things like that. Here's a sample that's pretty general, but is normal for lots of cases. It's from the register book of the Dalton Funeral Home in Durant, Oklahoma. There's a number of pieces of information that could be useful. This particular order is for the memorialization of 2-year-old Bessie Dillion. She's the daughter of Ed Dillion, and the form asks for such things as the name of the deceased and the relative's name, funeral date, the residence, the place and cause of death, and the clergy name, the place of the funeral, the occupation, and usually they ask the age in year, months, and days. And just general things like the removal instructions, cemetery and lot, and details of any burial treatment or costs. So how do we find the funeral home that our ancestor used at the time? Number 1, check the death certificate, or it may be listed in the obituary. If not, find out who is advertising as a funeral director in the area. You might use some of these search terms: undertaker, undertaking parlor, funeral director, or embalmer. Check the probate for disbursements or receipts for coffins or grave diggers. And city directories are always a good idea. If it's further back, check the census for funeral directors, and know that early cabinet makers would moonlight as undertakers as well. The cemetery office, though, sometimes you can work backwards, and the cemetery office can have a record of funeral directors or the undertaker. But if all of that doesn't work, and the ancestor has other family members who have died in the area, do the same thing for them. Because if you find their funeral home, it's likely that the family has used the same company. However, as I mentioned before, funeral homes have been bought out over time. So if you're trying to look for funeral homes that are in business today in that area, look at your public library for the American Blue Book of Funeral Directors, the Blue Book of Funeral Service, the National Yellow Book of Funeral Directors, and what's called the Red Book, which is the National Directory of Morticians. Yeah, that one's online. You can just check the yellow pages too in Google. But I'd also call or email the local historical society, county historian, to see if they have local knowledge of funeral homes, which manuscript collections might have those, or which businesses bought out which. Check catalogs of university libraries. They often get these kind of donations. And check the catalogs for FamilySearch, local historical society, genealogical societies, and the state archive. Or you can always just start at the cemetery and start driving around in concentric circles until you hit a funeral home. All right, well, that might not work. You might want to try Google Maps for that. But that whole concentric circle driving thing, that actually worked for me once. WorldCat, if you haven't heard of it before, is going to be your new best friend. It is the worldwide catalog of public libraries, university libraries, and other repositories that have partnered with it. So you can find a lot of unique manuscript collections listed in here. For this example, I'm using the search term Funeral Homes Baltimore. And I put in my zip code, and WorldCat gives me a list of how far away records can be that I'm looking for. And if it's too far, at least I know now who I can call to get a record lookup, or I can email them. But I looked on FamilySearch, and I put in the phrase under the keyword search, funeral home, and I filtered for my country, and then I filtered for available online records, and I got 847 hits just for funeral home. So they really do have a lot of records in there, but they're not necessarily indexed. Let's go to cemetery offices. Like funeral homes, these are independent businesses. So they may be run by a company or a religious organization. You got to check ahead and do the same things you did with the other. Make an appointment, offer to pay for services and copies. And their records are going to vary as well. It's not going to be the same as in the last cemetery office you might have been in. So they are more likely to have indexes online, but as I mentioned, they could be partial indexes, but rarely, if ever, are cemetery files online. How do you find the cemetery of your ancestor if you don't know where it is? Number one, check the death certificate. Number two, look for all the cemeteries in the last place of residence and the approximate date of death, and which ones were active at the time. Look at your ancestor's religion and see if that church has services or has church records that indicate where they were buried, or if that religion has a dedicated cemetery. Are there indexes in the area, and are some of them published or online? And check for obituaries, of course, but not just the obituaries in the place they died. Look for places like their hometown or other places where they had a significant presence. Just so you know, though, if you find your ancestor's headstone as a picture online, that is not copyright free. The copyright is owned by the photographer. So it is a courtesy and an act of copyright to ask permission before downloading, just so you know. So the files might contain copies of the death certificate, obituary, memorial cards, will, letters from the lawyer or the funeral home. And again, it's likely very much to have contracts because this is a business. information about the memorial service, family names, religious identifiers, but you're going to look also for the deeds that have the owner of the plot. Because if that plot owner is not somebody you recognize, you want to investigate that person. It's very likely somebody who is has a relationship with your ancestor. But also look for plot maps, diagrams, and details of burials in that particular lot. Or you might have none of the above, and that happens way too many times. Here's a quick example of why cemetery maps are so important. Investigate them before you go. I was going to visit the Mount Olivet Cemetery in Baltimore City, Maryland, and I learned that it was run by the Methodist Episcopal Church, and the records now are housed at the Lovely Lane Museum. Well, I checked their website, and they have beautiful maps, including these very detailed maps for each section. But they also have an entire index of all the burials. So I had the index and the map with me when I went. And so I looked and looked for the ancestor, and as you can see from the picture, I found a blank space. But the reason I know that this is a blank space where the ancestor was buried is because I had that index to verify who the plot neighbors were. Otherwise, I couldn't have identified it. Like funeral homes, some cemeteries kept books. Entries like this record book was kept by Forest Lawn Cemetery in Buffalo. That's in New York, and it spans 2 pages across a standard ledger style book. This cemetery office was very open and friendly with their files. This is Oak Hill in Washington, D.C. They have beautiful mausoleums, and they had diagrams, and on the diagram pages were lists of who was interred where, ages, and the date of interment, and even remarks about removals. The cemetery office had a variety of files, including separate ones for individual burials, like this one from 1877. The page shows the ancestor's name, birthplace, residence, death date, the age, marital status, and it directs treatment for the memorial service and a list of costs. Amazing. Baltimore. It's another winner in my book for generosity with their files and organization and a very kind staff. This stone is for William Hope and his wife, Henrietta Lavelle Hope, and it is becoming more and more badly worn by time. The information about the children is really only known to me because I found their deaths in obituaries, but I could hardly read it. The children are named for William's parents, by the way, Catherine and Daniel. We're going to compare this with information from the cemetery office, but before we go, we're going to find out how the cemetery office helped me get there. So the cemetery has quite a few things. First, they gave me this convenient little map on a paper pad that they had ready for finding the specific area. They wrote out the area and the lot and the walk and the little street and everything. And on the wall, they had a very specific map that I could take a picture of for each of the numbered lots. So I took a picture and carried that with me. It was great. This particular cemetery's burial started in 1850 and it's still an active cemetery, so they're quite used to genealogists by now. Most importantly, they have this wonderful card system. This is a plot diagram card, and it gives the lot numbers, death dates, names, and plot numbers on the front side. In the top right corner is the name of the lot deed owner, Solomon Lavelle, and that was Henrietta's father. Other Lavelles are buried there as well, but it's surprising, actually, that there's no listing of the burials for little Catherine and Daniel, who are clearly buried with their parents. Usually at Baltimore, I find it the other way around. I find burials listed on the card that don't have headstones. The Hopes lost one more young child, a girl named Oregon, who has a separate stone nearby. But what I found was 2 identical stones that were obliterated, except for the name Baby on the top. Which one is Oregon? Well, it was simple to find out because all I had to do was flip the card over and look at the diagram. On the right is Jonathan Higbee, who was 4 months old when he died, and on the left is Oregon Hope, who died in 1855. Other related Hope family members are buried across the cemetery, and I found for them burial cards. This one from 1906, the back and the front, shows the burial date, date of death, cause of death, the undertaker, residence, and the lot owner's name. This is from Martha Hope. She was the wife of John Thomas Hope. The lot owner is W.H. Hope. Well, that lot owner ended up being William H. Hope, which is not the same as the last William. It ended up being John Thomas Hope's older brother. And these two boys ended up being the cousin of the other William. This particular piece of paper and others were pieces of indirect evidence that helped me fit the family together. There's no end to the type of records you could find in cemetery offices. Here's one more. It's monument inscription orders from the Inglewood Park Cemetery in California. I do encourage you to look for plot deeds. Plot deeds are sometimes sold by individual cemetery companies, but sometimes cemeteries are run by the city, and plot deeds are handled by the local governmental offices or trustees, like this one from Brown Township in Paulding County, Ohio. Shows the lot owner, the residence of the purchaser, the lot number and the square, cemetery, the cost, and the date of the deed. So we'll end up with a case study. Where are the Whitmans? James Westcott Whitman and Elizabeth Kennicott Whitman are my great-great-great-great-grandparents, and they lived in Oakfield, formerly known as Cary, in Genesee County, New York, and I didn't know where they were buried. They lived in this little town, and I could tell that they were probably buried in the only town cemetery, which really wasn't that far from them. Eventually, when I went to the cemetery, as you'll see from my research, I found that 2 of their children were buried there. The first was Edward, who was buried there in 1864, and the second was Anna, who was buried there in 1902. But why was James and Elizabeth not buried there? Let's follow the search and how the search went. First, I tried Find a Grave, and this was back in 2002. At the time, there were no results for any Whitmans in this cemetery. So I almost gave up because I didn't at the time realize that these places like Find a Grave or any online index for cemeteries might not be 100% complete. So you always have to check the percent completeness. I decided that I really needed a trip up to my ancestral home. And so I went 7 hours up to New York and visited the county historian's office. I looked for obituaries, death records, probate. I just looked for everything. By the way, there was no probate for James at all, so I couldn't go with that. I did find an obituary and church record for Elizabeth's death. The obituary didn't mention a burial place at all. It was no help. The church record was unclear. So a couple of rows ahead, somebody had been buried in Cary, but then it may or may not have had scratches or ditto marks down to where Elizabeth was to indicate that she was also at Cary. So I just couldn't tell. James was not listed in the church record at all. I visited the town clerk because in New York, there are different jurisdictions than other places. So you want to visit not just the county, but also the town. And I asked about funeral homes or old cemetery records. And he said, oh, no, we haven't got anything. And I was gently persistent. And eventually he found on an old shelf behind something, an old rolled up, undated plot map that was about to fall apart. And it showed that J. Whitman purchased 5 plots circa the 1850s in an area surrounding where Edward and Anna are now buried that you saw. So he told me who was in charge of the cemetery, and I made an appointment with the caretaker, and she was kind enough to meet me there. She helped me find the plots, but explained that she has no other information about the cemetery or who may have run any of the funerals or anything like that from that time. I also, by the way, visited with the town historian and tried that, and she had nothing else. I found lots of other stuff about the family, but nothing on the burials. Later, after I got home, I found finally James's obituary at Fulton Postcards. It's a wonderful website for New York newspapers. But unfortunately, no burial information was on there. I did finally find his death date, or I was able to confirm it from what I thought it was. What can I do? We always look outside of our ancestor, and we try all of their relatives too. And that is the next step. I went to all of his children and looked at all of their obituaries. And finally, one of his youngest children, Anna, who was in that same cemetery, she had 4 separate obituaries and a memorial between 1902 and 1903. And the third of those 4 obituaries stated that Anna was, quote, buried near her parents. I got it. So now here's where my theory runs. I know that James and Elizabeth lost their first grandson, Alvirus, in about 1858. And I assume that that's what maybe prompted them to get these lots. Edward died in 1864, and we know that Anna didn't die until 1902. Why would there be a big space between Edward and Anna, if not for Elizabeth, who died in 1873, and James, who died in 1878? So in summary, funeral homes and cemeteries, they're usually private businesses. There are no demands you can make on them. But just be kind, offer payment, make appointments, and do your homework before you get there. But mostly, these are valuable, underutilized resources. I hope you will go and try these. So how many of those random samples used for this short video were found textually at in-person repositories, large microfilm collections, or somewhere online? Are you willing to miss twice the records you could have had by researching offline? Of course not. Cemetery and funeral home research is, of necessity, something that needs a personal approach. We are researchers. We go where the records are. We don't wait for them to come to us. Just make sure that your ancestors are known for more than just their names. I hope you've enjoyed this part and will join me again for part 3 of The Dead and the Dying, where we discuss cemetery iconography and recording. Thank you.